I'm very big on mentorship. I think it's really important for young people to have adults in their lives. At the age of 18 or 19, if you've graduated from high school, you don't have high school teachers anymore. You don't have college counselors or other counselors in high school. You're not in college, so you don't have professors and other advisors that you would have in college. You're kind of in between, but you need adults in your life. Somebody that you could check in with, that maybe once a month.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Path Found, the podcast about the real, messy, unexpected journeys that lead us to the work we love. I'm Monica Argandonia, and every week I talk with someone whose story proves there's no single right way to build a meaningful life. On this episode of Path Found, I talk with Jeffrey Selingo, a nationally recognized journalist, best-selling author, and leading voice on the future of higher education and the transition from college to career. He is author of There is Life After College, Who Gets In and Why, and his latest book, Dream School. Drawing on more than 25 years of reporting, Jeffrey challenges long-held assumptions about prestige, majors, and rankings, urging students and families to focus instead on skills, belonging, mentorship, and long-term outcomes. Let's get started. So, I read There is Life After College a few years ago, and I picked it up because I'm the academic advisor for our environmental science and policy majors, and I've had quite the career path, and so I came into academia late, and I knew, I had a lot to offer my students as far as kind of job advice. But it's been a long time since I was in my 20s and the workplace has changed. And so I picked up that book and I thought, let's see what advice I can get from here. And the guidance was amazing. And I think it made me become a better academic advisor, but it also made me become a better professor. So I really thought about what I was teaching in class and how I was teaching it, and then those soft skills. So I am here today with New York best-selling author Jeffrey Selingo, and who's inspired me greatly on my career path. And so I want to thank you so much for being here. That's how I discovered you. I've read every book since, including Dream School, your most recent book. So thank you for agreeing to be on this show.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I think all your books actually build on each other. And so if you don't mind, I want to start with There is Life After College. It was published almost 10 years ago now, so that's pre-COVID, pre-AI as we know it now. But you talk a lot about that in that book about the job skills that students need, and there's kind of a mismatch on what schools are teaching and doing in the classroom versus, what's needed out there. And there were programs that you mentioned in that book that, were evolving and in place. But do you think things have gotten better as far as correcting that mismatch?
I definitely think that colleges and universities have become much more focused on outcomes. Student success now, I think, is defined more than just retention and graduation rates, but also how students do after college. So I definitely think there's more of a focus on that. The problem is that colleges and universities were pretty far behind to begin with in 2016 when I wrote that book. And now in some ways, they've been playing catch up, and now the job market's changing yet again. And I mean by AI, right? So we know the early career, there's something happening with the early career job market based on the statistics. We don't quite know how it's happening, but we know that early career jobs are changing and disappearing. Some of it might be because of AI, not all of it, I don't think can be blamed on AI, but because of that, I think it requires yet another moment for colleges and universities to rethink how they're preparing students for those first jobs after college. And again, I think they were playing catch up already. And now, inevitably, I fear some of them will fall further behind.
And then you talk about, students are picking majors and they're trying to figure out, they almost think they're married to that major. I picked this and that's what I have to do. And, my own daughter, she wants to go to film school, but she loves history, and talks about it all the time. And I asked her just this weekend, why wouldn't you want to major in history? And she said, well, what would I do with that? And, as the job market's changing and as AI is, that has a huge role in this. And you talk about how the liberal arts are going to be more important, right? Those kinds of skills. So when students are, and you've talked to tons of families and students, when they're picking a major, what would you say to someone like my daughter who said, well, what would I do with history? And And how would you go about picking a major?
Well, first of all, I think we put too much pressure on picking a major. Most people don't know what they want to do at 18. They don't know what they want to do at 28, 38, 58, whatever, right? I think, and most people, when I go and do talks and we talk about majors, I often ask the parents in the audience, how many of them are working in jobs that directly relate to their major? Now, that's probably a moment where you're trying to interpret that question. So I get it. It's not a scientific survey, but whenever I ask that question, a bunch of hands go up, but it's definitely not the majority in any audience that I speak to. So I think it goes back to this idea that most people do not work in something directly related to their major. It's more about the skills that major taught them. Now I understand if you want to be an accountant, major in accounting, a pharmacy, major in pharmacy, right? There's certain jobs I get, but most jobs do not lead directly from a major. And so to me, it's really around the skills, the skills of the mind. What are you trying to understand? And in many ways, I'm a perfect story for that. I grew up in a family where my mother didn't go to college. My father was a high school teacher. And I remember getting college at that time, this was before the internet, getting mailing from colleges and universities. And I wanted to be a journalist. I knew I wanted to be a journalist since I was in middle school. And I would look at the list of majors often that these view books or brochures had when they would mail them through the US Postal Service. And I would look at the back, and if they didn't have journalism, I'd just basically toss it aside because I thought to be a journalist, you had a major in journalism. And what I've come to understand, and I had a great undergraduate experience, I wouldn't trade it for the world, but what I've come to understand in now being a journalist and now going on to author books and do a lot of other work, it was really the skills of what journalism taught me that got me to where I am today. But those skills could have and probably should have, if I had to do it over again, been taught in a number of other fields, psychology, sociology, history, English. I mean, really almost anything. If you have a background in statistics, you could be a really good journalist. You could be a science journalist with having a degree in biology, right? So in other words, you don't have to major in what you end up doing. And I think there are so many examples of people out there like that. And I fear that because we ask students when they're applying to college to pick a major often because we need to sort them in some way, I fear that students feel like they have to pick something at that point that is going to be a job.
Yeah, and I think I always tell my students, you can major in anything. Just love it. Because if you love it, you're going to do well. And you're going to want to be there and you're going to want to show up. But they can't, it's very hard, I think, especially in this job market for them to understand that because they're thinking, I have to get a job. And so I think, there is a challenge. My own 13-year-old, she hates when people ask her, well, what are you going to do when you grow up? And what do you want to major in? And she goes, I don't know. I haven't lived yet. So, I think it's easier to say that to students, but how, even as a teacher in the classroom, how can we, if you were in the classroom and you're talking to these students and you're presenting these kinds of things, how do you make it clearer that what they major in doesn't necessarily have to be directly linked to that job?
Well, I think examples really help. The more they can meet people in different jobs who can then reverse engineer their own careers. I love to do this just looking at LinkedIn, right? Like often you could just take a trip through LinkedIn, see what are interesting jobs out there and see what people majored in. And I think you will discover very quickly by just looking at 10, 20, 30 profiles that yes, some people majored in finance to become CFO of a company, if that's what you want to do, but not everybody did. And I think that's important. And then what I think's happening, however, though, is that, first of all, some students are picking, they know what they want to do very early on. I have a 16 and a 14-year-old at home too. And my 16-year-old particularly tells me often that other kids at school, well, they kind of know what they want to do. I will argue, by the way, maybe, but maybe not. We know a third of students are going to change their major in college anyway. So even if you claim to know what you want to do in high school, you don't often. Second, I think most of us are surrounded by jobs that are familiar to us. And that's a very small slice of jobs across America, across the world. And so we really don't have a lot of exposure to what even jobs exist out there. And then third, I think one of the reasons why students are picking majors is because the most popular majors, often in STEM and business, for example, at big schools are capacity controlled, meaning there's not a lot of seats. colleges want you to apply directly into that major. And so you have to pick a major on your application, or else you can't get into it ever at that institution. That's not true at every institution, but we think it is true at every institution. So people think, well, I have to pick a major because this institution wants me to pick a major. That may be true at that institution, but it's not true at every institution.
So that's a great segue into this next thing about picking the school then. And, now you've argued a lot, especially in Dream School, but even in Who Gets In and Why, about the prestige factor and how students are choosing colleges. And so I think you'll appreciate this story because when I was in high school, I applied to Harvard and I asked one of my teachers to write me a letter of recommendation. And she gave me the copy of the letter. And she said, I'm giving you this because I want you to know what I said. And I don't mean it as an insult, although it might sound harsh. And she said, it's more of a lesson for you. And in the letter, she wrote, Harvard does a great job of making silk purses out of silk purses. And Monica is neither a silk purse nor a sow's ear. And my recommendation is tempered more on her happiness than her ability to do well. And at the time, I had no idea. At 17, I had no idea what that meant. I forgot about that letter. And then I read your books and I'm like, that is what that meant, right? That Harvard makes silk purses out of silk purses. And so this idea of prestige, like, how did you even get there? I mean, where was your moment of where you realized, parents were really kind of picking these colleges and students for these various reasons, but that wasn't always the right reason?
I think part of it is that I've seen in the years that I've been reporting on higher education, now 25 years plus, and writing a couple of books and spending time with parents and students and counselors, that it is kind of not a well-balanced system. And what do I mean by that? In that, there are thousands of institutions out there. If we think about 4,000 plus institutions in the US, if we just take four-year institutions for a second, right? If we take out all the special purpose institutions like the theology institutes and the music and art institutes, and we even take out the really tiny colleges. So we're still talking about a universe of 12 to 1,400. And thus, we don't really know how to choose a college as a result. We often look for people around us. We ask them where they're going. We look at the rankings to make sense of that. And so I really wanted to kind of bust that open and really have people think differently about how they choose college. Some of it is around prestige because it's what we hear around us. It's where the schools, colleges that people in our high school go to. It's what we hear in our community. It's the stickers we see on back of cars. It's what we see in the rankings. And that to me is not that that's a wrong way to pick a college, but it's not the only way to pick a college. And by the way, when you do it that way, when you just look for the names that are around you, you are going to see, on average, the same names over and over again. And it's kind of a flywheel effect after that because people just keep going to the same ones. And so I really wanted to bust that open and really, again, rethink about what we're looking for in a good college. So giving people the tools to understand that. First of all, to understand what they're looking for in a good college, and then the tools to actually find those schools. And that's really the premise behind Dream School.
And it's hard. I've talked to lots of parents now, and it's, students still applying for those same top colleges and, the names and going after all that. Is there ever an advantage? I've tried to tell my own daughter, she wants to, again, go to film school. She wants to go to USC Film School. But USC Film School comes with, an incredible alumni network, right? As somebody said, you're paying for the Rolodex. Are there advantages at all to going to some of these top name schools if you can get in? Or are they just making, great students out of great students?
Well, I think they are making great students out of great students, right? As I always point out, it's really hard. Really what you hope Harvard does is that they take you and they don't ruin you over 4 years, right? They're not often shaping you, they're shaping you a little bit, but they're often not making you somebody you're not after 4 years, where I think the vast majority of colleges and universities do really help students travel from A to B. And you want to help find the place that's going to help you travel the furthest, the farthest, and help you the most in that lifelong journey. And that, I think, is much more difficult to do for the vast majority of institutions who are dealing with a wider array of students, But that also makes you a stronger student and a stronger graduate as a result, because you're surrounded by people who are some who have different talents, some who have different backgrounds, and some who are more talented than you are in some things, less talented than you in other things. But that is often how you're going to be working in the world, right? Like, I have never worked on a team in my 25 years of work, whether it's at, the Chronicle of Higher Education, whether it's the own teams I put together around my books, with my publisher, with Arizona State University. So I've had the opportunity to work with many different teams in my life, and I've never worked with the most perfect team, right? It's like group work, right? Nobody ever works in the most perfect group. And I think you're going to have more of the opportunity to work with people who are different than you at these colleges that are, how to put it, deeper in the rankings, less selective, whatever you want to use. I hate to use any of those terms because I think it puts a title on those colleges when you shouldn't. But I think you're going to work with such a wider array of students at those that it actually prepares you better for the workforce as a result.
I think that's interesting. So your argument would be, finding, and I think you say this in your book, Dream School, but finding the place that you feel like you fit in would be number one, right? In looking for a school. Like you mentioned some of the stories about students who end up at school and then drop out, even dropping out of an Ivy League. So finding that place where you fit in. And your argument would be that in maybe those kind of smaller, less known schools, again, I don't want to give them a tag either, but why would it be? Because that they're going to do better? Why would it be that they're going to be more qualified? Well, why can't I go to one of those smaller schools and just kind of get by also?
Yeah, I think part of it is that, and the purpose of Dream School is not to discourage you from applying to the most selective colleges. They are wonderful institutions. I really do think it is the diversity of American higher education is both a positive and a negative of higher ed. The positive is that we have a much more diverse system than any other country in the world. I think that's the positive. The negative is it really makes it hard to find the right fit as a result, because there's not an easy answer. That I think it is true in other countries where it's just a smaller system, easier to navigate as a result. But so among the top colleges, I mean, one of the things you are going to get there is a terrific network. I think mostly you're buying a network at these places. And if you look at any of the more recent coverage, there's big headlines around Harvard recently because there was a big report that came out on grading there. And the bottom line was, when you get to Harvard, you don't really have to work very hard in classes, because the whole focus is on extracurricular activities and the networking that helps you get the job afterwards. And these places are wonderful. I didn't get to go to one, but I know people who did. Their alumni networks are stronger, I believe, than most colleges and universities. They kind of look out for each other. They are clubs in that way. And if that's what you want to buy, go for it. And if you can get in, great. And if you could afford it, even better. But that doesn't mean that those networks don't exist at other places, and that through the ability of working hard and understanding how to get jobs. I think a lot of this is networking, and I don't think we teach it very well in colleges, but I do think that there is a way to replicate some of that experience at a vast majority of colleges and universities, where at the most selective it's kind of built in and you're just buying into it. But I don't think you're buying necessarily, in my opinion, a better education.
And even, I think you make this argument too in your books, it's also, you can go to those colleges, you can go anywhere, but it's not where you go as much as how you do college. What do you mean when you say how you do college?
So what I mean is not being a spectator to the experience. You have 4 years, maybe more, maybe less, depending on where you go, to make the most of this experience in college. And I think that many students go to college, and too many students, I should say, go to college as a spectator to what is the sport that's happening on the field of college. And what do I mean by that? It means taking a variety of classes, some of which you obviously need for your major, but some that might interest you and might take you in new directions, by the way, with your major. That you didn't even know existed, where you can meet other people who have different interests than you do, or professors that do. And again, a lot of this comes back to personal experience. I was very lucky because I had AP credit coming into college to finish essentially in 3.5 years. I had to take one class the second semester of my senior year, and I'll never forget having this debate with a professor of mine who said, well, why don't you just fill out a little bit more of your schedule with all these classes you never had a chance to take as an undergraduate? I'm like, why would I want to do that? I could work. I actually had the opportunity to work for the local newspaper the second semester of my senior year. Well, to be honest with you now, 25 years of working, I'm like, I had the rest of my life to do work. I didn't have the rest of my life, although I guess I could, to take those classes. And I kind of am sorry I didn't do that. Not only classes that would interest me, but classes that probably could help my career now in different ways. So I think that's part of it, is that is really engaging in the campus experience, not only in the classroom by taking classes that are interesting or different, meeting professors, meeting other students, but also the extracurricular activities as well. And again, it helps you meet new and different people who think differently about the world and get access to things that you didn't know existed. So again, a lot of my work is biographical in some ways. I grew up in a family where my mother didn't go to college. My father was a high school music teacher. And when I got to Ithaca College, where I went to undergrad, I knew I wanted to be a journalist. And the first summer I got to stay in Ithaca to work, I had to work, so I needed to I had one part-time job. I needed to find another part-time job, and a mentor. So I'm very big on mentors, helped me find that second part-time job. But it was on another part of campus that I had never even been to really, and met people in student affairs. And I didn't even know this whole division of student affairs really existed. I was kind of in my own little bubble that first year of college. And I got to meet people in a way and understand what the idea of a residential college campus was like. And that enabled me my sophomore through senior year to take advantage of things that I didn't even know existed. And again, all of these things happen on college campuses, but we're too often a spectator to them.
And I totally agree with that. I mean, I tell my students all the time, network, network, network. Start with your peers. This is, the people you're going to work with in the future. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that is great advice. And it's, even the students who come into my office, most of the time, they're not even there to talk about the class stuff. They're there to talk about, well, how did you get your job? And what do I do? And what do I do after? And and those are the students you remember. And I tell them it's not even the A students. It's not the 4.0 students. It's the students that put in the extra effort to navigate college and get to know their professors and take advantage of all that. So yeah, I think that I couldn't agree more. And I wish more students could hear that advice and really do that. I'm also a big fan of gap years because I think so many of my students, the ones that come later, that are a little older, do so much better because now they know why they're there and they're committed and, they've just had that experience. Do you think gap years are still, is that an option? Should we be pushing that more for students?
Well, I mean, there is a privilege to get one, I think, because you still have to figure out how to live and take care of yourself for that year after high school. But I do like them for this reason, especially if you really have no idea what you want to do. You're just going to college to go through the motions. But as I point out in There Is Life After College, there has to be some structure around it. And so you have to find that structure. And there's 3 elements to it, as you probably remember from There Is Life After College. One of them was you need to be exercising your academic muscles during that year. Much easier now, by the way, with online courses. So even if you take an online course or 2, continuing to exercise that academic muscle is really important. Second, you need to be in some sort of structured program, whether that is work, travel, something else, volunteer work. You need to have some sort of structure to your days, to your weeks. And that's where, again, expense might come in. You might have to, if you work and get paid for it, great. But if you have to pay for something, you have to travel, obviously that costs money. That's a privilege that not everybody else has. The third part, though, is the one we often forget. And this is, I think, probably the most important. I'm very big on mentorship. I think it's really important for young people to have adults in their lives who give them advice, who tell them, it's not even young people. I still use mentors throughout my life of people who help me. And at the age of 18 or 19, if you've graduated from high school, you don't have high school teachers anymore. You don't have college counselors or other counselors in high school. You're not in college. So you don't have professors and other advisors that you would have in college. You're kind of in between. Yes, hopefully you have your family and parents, but you need adults in your life, somebody that you could check in with. So I often encourage people, find somebody. It could be a family friend. It could be maybe a teacher who has time, somebody that you can just check in if you're going to take a gap year over the course of that year, that maybe once a month, maybe twice a month, if you're really lucky, say, hey, can we just have a check-in call? We put it on the calendar so that you have somebody in your life who, beyond like a family member, who can really help you through this year, that you could bounce ideas off of, and that could potentially put you in touch with other people that could be helpful.
I totally agree. Mentors are so important. I think sometimes people don't, especially young people, don't understand what that is. And, you don't know what you don't know. And so how can we, as educators, whether in high school or college, what would you suggest? How can we get students to look for those people in their life? How can we promote that more?
It's hard. And I think that some people are wired for finding mentors. I think others are just natural mentors in life, and they seek out people who need them. But I agree that it doesn't happen naturally. I'm a big fan in Dream School. I talk often about these schools that have built first year experiences, where they have built very intentional programs that put students in front of adults and faculty who are sometimes outside of their major, that almost forces them into knowing that these people can be mentors for them. Because I don't think if you build structure around it, I think it's going to be very difficult for it to happen. So that is where I would do. Like, how do you create almost a mentorship program as part of the first year experience at colleges and universities? That to me is the challenge, because it's not going to happen naturally for a lot of students.
And I think it's especially important for those students who don't have other resources. And those are the students that are the hardest to reach and to get the mentor. So,
well, there's not a lot of trust, right? I get it. I meet students who don't have a lot. They're cynical about the system. They don't have a lot of trust in the system because the system hasn't really served them well. These are often the students, by the way, in college who do need mentors, because they don't really, they may be first generation. They don't have a lot of experience in their life around college. This was me. I described this in Dream School. I was lucky again because I had a father who went to college, who taught high school. I had two older siblings who went to college locally. But when I got to college, it was only 2.5 hours from home, but it might as well been in a foreign land. Nobody from my high school had ever gone to this college. I was surrounded by people who grew up in much bigger places and did things that I didn't even know existed when I was 18. And having somebody to just help you know that you're not alone, right? I have a whole chapter dedicated to this in Dream School, this idea of belonging and finding that sense of belonging. And often you either need a college to tell you that it's okay, you're not alone, there are other people like you, and I didn't know that. Or you need to find a mentor to just get you excited about something and get you to plug into something. And that, two people in my first year, and again, it was almost by accident, but one of them was a macroeconomics professor who really helped me understand the power of faculty and the power of office hours, and that faculty were there to be helpful. And then the second one was the newspaper advisor to the college newspaper, who just helped me navigate life in many ways, right? And really understanding the structures of the institution, both internally, but also externally, and led me to the internships I eventually had and things like that. So I found both of those adults originally, that first semester of college, in some ways by accident. And that shouldn't be.
I think back at the mentors I had, and I wouldn't have recognized them as being that. Later back as an adult, reflecting on if they hadn't been there to help me or kind of give me this advice, I'm not sure. Yeah, they were mentors, but I didn't know what the word was. I didn't know what to call them. So I was fortunate. So the other topic I'd like to talk about is the cost of school, because we've talked now, gap years could be a privilege. There's an inequity in resources available to students, and colleges are outrageously expensive. I mean, my jaw is dropping looking at tuition prices right now. Again, being in higher ed, I have a couple of questions around this. The cost of college, and then all the add-ons now. I mean, it's almost like the bachelor's degree is the high school diploma. And now, colleges and universities are pushing master's programs and certificates. And they're making it as easy as possible for anybody. You can take online classes and, at night and the whole bit. And it's expensive. I mean, and you can do it anywhere, and all of them are doing it. Is this really just forget the undergrad expense? I'll talk about that in a minute. But all those add-ons, is it worth it? Is it worth it in this job market?
You mean college in general?
College in general, but also and everything that they're tacking on. I guess there's a lot of pressure right now, and I'm seeing it at my university, pushing these students into easy ways to go on to stay another year and you'll get the master's degree. Or let's have this certificate. And, I always tell students, don't rush into grad school.
Right. There's no reason to rush. So that is not worth it right off the bat. Like, I think you have to have a reason to go for a certificate or a grad school or something in addition to the bachelor's degree. I do still think the bachelor's degree is worth it. Looking at any data around the bachelor's degree, we know that the bachelor's degree gives you options. It gives you flexibility that you wouldn't have otherwise. Now, is every bachelor's degree worth it? Is every bachelor's degree in every major from every institution worth it? No. So I do think I'm a big fan actually of what the Department of Ed is doing right now with attaching outcomes data around the FAFSA, for example, when students fill out the FAFSA. I think it's a great idea. So I do think that we need to watch what bachelor's degrees we get and from where, but that's a small minority of bachelor's degrees. I think for the vast majority of them, they're worth it.
Why do you think it's so expensive?
It's like the number one question I've been getting about college for 25 years. Well, it's expensive because it can be. I think that there's really no limiter on college costs, largely because it's a heavily subsidized institution. These are heavily subsidized institutions, whether they're public or private, either by the state or the federal government. That could be changing. It already is changing. It has been changing. We've just been transferring those costs to families, and on the back of families, often who then have to go into the debt market to pay for this. And there's been no real change for that over the years. It's also not a very transparent market. Like you could actually get a degree for a very low price or free in some cases. So in California, for example, you could get an associate's degree at a California community college essentially for free, depending on your income. It's very generous financial aid programs. Most people don't know that, right? You go to Cal State and get a degree, again, depending on income, for a very reasonable cost and really good outcomes in some programs. But most people don't know that because it's not a very transparent system. And then finally, why does it cost so much? It's a very people-centric industry. It's just like healthcare. It's a lot of people, many of whom are either highly compensated or highly educated. Again, just like healthcare, and it's a market that has not self-regulated in a way to control those costs. It's just easy to do more because you always want to do more. Well, why can't we add another major? Why can't we add more people to do X, Y, and Z on these campuses? Why can't we have nicer buildings? As somebody once told me, there is no constituency to really reduce costs because everybody wants something out of the higher education system.
So you don't see costs coming down anytime soon?
Well, I do, mainly because I think that we are we well past a breaking point right now. And if colleges and universities want to support students, they're going to have to become more affordable.
And I guess that brings me to the financial aid. You put out all this data on, all these different colleges. You call them buyers and sellers. And then how much financial aid they're giving. Wouldn't it just make more sense just to bring the cost of the tuition down and instead of playing that game?
Well, there is a little bit of a Chivas Regal effect in higher ed, in that the more we pay for something, the better quality we think it is. Colleges have developed this weird discounting system where nobody really pays full price at a lot of these places. And somebody would just say, well, why don't they just charge less if they're already going to give everybody a discount? But people love discounts. It's like why we love coupons and why we go to sales, but it's a perpetual sale in higher ed. It really makes no sense to me. Nobody has kind of come up with a new financing system, a new pricing system, I should say. Eventually that will come, but this is the best we can do right now, I think.
And I'm going to push back a little bit on what you said about community colleges. I'm not knocking community colleges at all. And I think it is, yes, you can go 2 years here free in California. But to me, community college and even how some of I teach at a Cal State, you're talking 2 years of what seems like high school all over again, right? These GE classes. And my daughter hates math, hates math. And, her idea is I will never have to take math again when I go to college. I'm like, well, do you think that there is a benefit to having 2 years of GE? And then even if you go to a 4-year, you still, in most places, still have those 2 years of GE. Do you think there's a benefit to that? Or should we be reducing that and thinking of it a different way and even making college maybe 3 years instead of 4?
A lot of questions in there. Let me just focus on community colleges for a second. One is that it doesn't work everywhere. And a couple of things. One is that there are some community colleges where the associate's degree actually pays off. Some associate's degrees don't pay off. You really do need the bachelor's degree. So in those cases, the associate's degree is no better than the high school diploma. And I would not recommend then going unless you are going to transfer to a 4-year college. But there are some standalone associate's degrees that do have a good payoff. Eventually, you may need a bachelor's or a master's degree, but that's down the road. Second, if you get an associate's degree that doesn't really pay off and you really do need to get a 4-year degree, then you really do need to go to an institution that has a close collaboration with that community college. It works well in some states. It doesn't work well in other states. But for example, I live outside of DC in Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia Community College and George Mason have a direct admit program where you essentially get into George Mason when you apply to the community college. As long as you keep your GPA at a certain level, those courses will automatically transfer into George Mason. You will become a junior. You won't have to take those GE courses over again you're going to actually also be taking courses from your major, what your intended major is as an associate student. You're also going to get an ID for George Mason. So you're going to feel like you're one of them rather than, a student at Northern Virginia Community College. That works really well. Florida has another example of that in their direct admit program. Those are few and far between. So I'm not saying that that is the gold standard. Unfortunately, it's not in enough places.
Okay. So then that's kind of the first part. I know I packed in a lot in that question, but what about, is it worth 2 years of GE? Should we be reducing colleges to 3 years and following more a European style maybe, where you just go and you study what you want? Or is there a benefit to having 4 years and a lot of general ed packed in there?
Well, I mean, general ed is important. I do think that general ed needs to be redesigned in many places because most people can't. It's hard for some students to get through it because they don't see the relevancy of it. So I would like it. I think general education is important. I would like to see it taught in a different way. I would like to see it sequenced in a different way.
Can you expand on that? Do you have an idea? If you were...
I don't have a specific idea. I would love it to be, I would like to look, basically you learn concepts and then you apply them in real time so that maybe general education is chunked in a different way so that it comes at the time you need it rather than all up front. There's opportunity for hands-on learning so that you can apply what you're learning so that you understand why you need this at the time you're getting it, whether that's a psychology class, an English class, whatever it might be, that you're learning it and applying it in real time.
Yeah, and I don't think we do a good job of that.
No.
Yeah. One of the other things you bring up is that high school now is about checking off these boxes, right? This kind of pressure cooker. You have to do this, and this in order to get into college, and that we've lost that, what high school should be, right? And there's a place of exploration and kind of finding out those things and pursuing those passions that you like. But it's really hard to tell students that when everybody else is doing it, right? If I tell my kid, well, you don't have to do all these things, but mom, everybody else is doing it, I'm not going to get into college. What do you like? How do we change that for high schoolers? Because I do think it's overwhelming.
Yeah, I mean, it is overwhelming. And I think that we change that in high school by talking about the fact that there are more than just 25 or 30 colleges out there. And when we do that, and people see that they can get in to a lot of different places, they understand then that everything in high school is not about college. And that high school is a vehicle, is a container in and of itself. And I get it. If you want to go to a highly selective college, there is a race you have to start running pretty early on in life. Most people don't want to do that. Most people don't need to do that. And so I think for everybody else, we have to be very clear that high school is a moment in their life, that it doesn't have to be about college. And the more that we can show that, the more we can show that you can actually get into college, without having to, take 50,000 AP courses and dual enrollment courses and participate in 10 activities and do all these things that we think you have to do for every college. Yes. Do you have to do that for the most selective colleges? Unfortunately, you do. There's a lot of applicants and very few seats. But for the vast majority of colleges and universities that the vast majority of American students go to, you don't. And that's the story that I think is lost in this. And that's the story really of Dream School.
So, this podcast has been about people's stories, their career paths, and, again, how they got from point A to point B. And so I would be amiss not to ask you, what was your life? Like you've already mentioned, your mom, was not a college graduate. Your dad did. But what were you like in a kid? How did you pick Ithaca and your major?
So as I said earlier, I wanted to be a journalist since I was in middle school. And so every time a piece of mailing would come through, I would look at the back and look at the list of majors. And if journalism wasn't listed, I toss it away. Because again, I thought I had to major in journalism to be a journalism. So that really narrowed, by the way, the schools. I ended up at Ithaca largely because my father was a high school music teacher. Ithaca started as a music conservatory in the late 1800s, and he knew of it. I knew of it. It had a very good communications school. It still does. And a number of famous journalists of my generation had graduated from there, or people I knew in my generation. And so that's really, there wasn't really that much of a secret to it. It was also 2.5 hours from home. And it gave me a generous financial aid package. So a lot of the little pieces came together. I knew so little about higher education compared to especially today back then that it all made sense to me and it all seemed to have worked out, but it could have easily gone a different way. And that's often what I think about when I write about higher ed. These are both low stakes and high stakes decisions. Low stakes in that, is there that much of a difference between Harvard and Yale and Princeton? No. High stakes, is there a difference between majoring in X and Y and going to this institution over that institution? Yes, sometimes there is, and we should know those outcomes. Is there a difference between going to college and not going to college? Yes. There's a lot of decisions that you're big and small that you're going to make that have higher stakes in this process. And my hope in writing this book particularly was to try to translate some of those so that we are focused on the right things, that we're asking the right questions on college tours, and that we're making the decisions not based on what U.S. News and World Report says, but what we want out of this process.
So you continued in journalism. You stuck with what you wanted to do. You were one of those rare people who
ended up doing what they majored in. Yeah.
Yes. But how did you get into higher ed? I've described you as the higher ed guru when I talk to you to my friends. I'm like, you got to read this book. It's, how did you get into that? Like this?
Like a lot of things in life. And I think this is true of any major or any career. A lot of it is by accident. I didn't set out to be a higher ed journalist. So I wanted to be a journalist. I worked on the student newspaper. And so as a result, you just become very interested in administration and faculty issues because you're working on that. My senior year of college, as I said, I worked for the local newspaper, and in Ithaca, New York, there was also this other institution on the other hill called Cornell. And it was a big player, obviously, in the town. And so that was one of the things I covered. There, I ended up interning at U.S. News and World Report between my junior and senior year and worked on the college rankings. So all of these things combined gave me this interest and background in higher ed. But then I went off and I did other things. I covered technology. I covered the environment. I worked for a couple of papers in Arizona and North Carolina. And I really wanted to come back to DC because I'd interned there. So this is where the accident happens. A job opens up at the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is essentially the Bible of higher ed. And I think, that gets me back to DC. That was my goal. But more than that, I was like, okay, I'll do this job for 2 years and go off and do what I really want to do in journalism. And then I got to the Chronicle, and it just allowed me to do these really cool reporting projects that I didn't even know. It just higher ed became immensely fascinating as an industry. And I didn't really think about it until I worked at the Chronicle. I had a lot of opportunities to rise in the ranks in the Chronicle that I probably wouldn't have had otherwise. And that's where the accident happens. It all came together.
So what are you telling your kids now as they're headed off? You said you got a 16-year-old. What advice are you giving them?
Yeah, one piece of advice that I give is patience. I'm not a very patient person, by the way, but I tell other people to be patient. But I think patience in careers is incredibly important. I think that we think, when you look at your parent, if your parents are in their careers, I didn't see this at home because, as I said, my father was a teacher. So, your teachers, by the way, great career, but you're kind of doing the same thing every year for the most part. But there's so many careers out there where by the time you're in high school looking at colleges and you look in your own family, your parents are often of an age and a point in their career where they've done all the grunt work and they're now fully immersed in the career. And they seem successful to you. And you're like, oh, that's where I should start out, right? We often think that's where we start out. And that's not true for the vast majority of people. And so I think I've seen more careers be derailed because people are impatient. They want that job tomorrow. They want to move on to the next job within 6 months. They want to get promoted within a year. Careers are long, they're lengthy, they're not linear. And that's the advice I always give to people is patience, because things will happen over time.
I think that's great advice. And I'm not patient either, but I will try to remember
Yeah, I'm not
that.
patient in my life. I try to be more patient in my career. That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I think, again, I think any parent of a high schooler should be reading these books. I've now told my students that they should read There's Life After College book. So thanks for the work you've done and for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm glad that we were able to be connected. And thank you for these fantastic questions. These are things I obviously have been writing about. Some of these questions I haven't really thought about. And so I think they're really important. And thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to Path Found. If anything we talked about today connected with you or gave you a new perspective, we'd love it if you subscribed, left a review, or shared the episode with someone you care about. You can also find us on Instagram at Path Found Podcast. To explore more stories, resources, and ways to get involved, visit KeystoneNetwork.org. This podcast is just one part of the journey. At Keystone Network, we're helping young people and anyone figuring it out as they go build meaningful futures one step at a time. A huge thank you to my podcast editor, David Strutt. You can find him on LinkedIn for helping bring these stories to life, and to Elizabeth Miner at Silvermine Creative for the beautiful artwork and web design. And if you're on your own path, navigating the unknown, making a pivot, or simply figuring it out as you go, just know you're not alone. The route may not be linear, but there's always a way forward. I'm Monica Argandonia, and I'll see you next time on Path Found.